Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, April 6th, 2022, and today we're coming to you from the ACRO conference in Portland, Oregon, where I've spent the last 3 days learning from the association and its international educators who have attended. It's a larger conference for about 2,000 to 3,000 individuals, and first time they've been meeting in person in the last 2 years. That'll be, as you'll see in the themes of today's topics we'll be covering, about in-person conferences and conferences that you'll be attending this year. We're going to take a look at some of the differences that we've seen in the last couple of months, the last 2 conferences that I've attended in December and now April. And we'll share with the audience today what our thoughts are on how much closer we are to new normal of in-person meetings. So as we do each week, we take 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days to go a little bit more in depth and share our thoughts on how these topics are really manifesting themselves in our work. And today obviously is no different, just a little bit different setting for the conversation. So let's get right into our first question of the day. I'll run through each of them first and share a couple of insights as we've gone through the last few days here in Portland. First up, what are in-person conferences like today? Second, do you have an international strategic plan? And third, what conferences will you be attending this coming year? And we all know that the last 2 years have not been easy as the pandemic has come and gone and come again and is in retreat perhaps in some places and still new cases appearing every day in others. And thoughts I wanted to share today on these topics are related to why I was here in Portland. I had a session yesterday on starting from square one, internationalization efforts at UNLV, presented with my old friend and colleague, Steve McKellips, who's AVP at, basically Chief Enrollment Officer at UNLV. And our session covered the last year at UNLV when they had made the decision to internationalize. I'll talk more about that in response to the second question of the day. But in terms of what are in-person conferences like now, we do have had in-person conferences since late fall with a couple, including AirC in Miami in early December. And we've seen a couple of other, beyond international education, the return to in-person conferences has been welcomed by many in a lot of different places around the United States. They are beginning to look different. What I attended in December is different than what it is today. Back in December, we had to go through vetting process, but we had to either have a negative COVID test a day before, 2 days before the conference, or have uploaded documentation of vaccination. So that's probably the wrinkle that will stay with us for a bit in terms of in-person conferences. At that conference in Miami, even though it was in Miami in Florida in a state that has fairly relaxed COVID regulations, the conference itself decided to, and even don't know if it was the hotel as well, but for all inside events, masks had to be worn. Speakers could ask permission to not have their masks on when they were presenting, but for the most part it was a masked conference and one that you had to document vaccination or negative COVID tests in order to attend. So fast forward 4 months to early April 2022, and with the ACRO conference here in Portland, Portland has recently relaxed their mask requirements. In fact, signs are still up all over the city and in most restaurants that masks are required, but they're not enforced at all. In fact, the conference itself had indicated that masks were to be worn in the lead up to the event, though I think things have been very fluid in regards to in-person conferences. So I see certainly when I came in the doors to register on Monday, or Sunday, excuse me, there were less than half people were wearing masks. Certainly wasn't being enforced in any way. So I think it was just a level of comfort thing for individuals. There was no real communication in the days leading up to the conference that masks were no longer going to be optional. So I had my supply of 3 or 4 masks in my bag that I could have pulled out. I had one in my pocket that was ready to put on. But the general gist of it was that no, you don't have to wear a mask. We did the process. We did have a vaccination and/or negative COVID test requirements to attend. That was made clear from the beginning. So in the previous conference back in December, we had to upload our documents, and then they were vetted and then erased once a checkbox had been put next to our name for registration. But here, there was an actual app that prior to the conference, we'd have to upload our documents to, and then we'd have a digital badge that we would show when we checked in to verify that we had uploaded our vaccination records and we were good to go. That is probably was through an app called Clear that we have on our phones that presents the opportunity to show your status, kind of the digital badge. So some versions of these, and here's mine. I'll point it up to the camera. So I had a digital badge like that, show the QR code. They quickly scanned it, and I was good to go for the rest of the conference. So very simple process, but it worked. And no complaints really from anyone that I've heard of. Most were eager to be meeting back in person. I think that's still going to be the general theme of as in-person conferences resume. I know this particular conference is almost exclusively domestic individuals. There's a couple of Education USA advisors that had come. 3 of the REACs also were in attendance at this conference from different parts of the world. But international travel is still is much more complicated than domestic because they do have to show vaccination and negative COVID test results before they can fly within 2 days, and that's a new reality. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. Maybe the testing requirement might go away if when things have settled down enough, but at this point, that is the proof of vaccination is required in order to travel internationally. So what does that mean for international conferences coming up? And we'll talk more about that with our third question of the day. But I did want to talk about our question number 2. And this is a question that when I'm working with college and university clients is number 1 or 2 on the list of reasons why we're having a conversation. Why are you interested in engaging with me as part of some international education, international recruitment, international enrollment needs that you have on campus? So I always start with, do you have a strategic plan? Not only at the university level, if you do, does it include international in any mention whatsoever? Not always the case. In fact, I would say probably less than half of university plans mention international specifically in strategic planning at the university level. They may have a recruitment plan that might be a year-to-year thing, but rarely are those strategic. And that's always where I start my conversations, is just to get a sense of how sophisticated that institution's international office is, that institution as a whole, are in terms of their vision for international. This is, and I have a lot of colleagues who I respect immensely in the field who have worked on the institutional side for years, and they do tend to go year to year with their planning for recruitment in particular. Some more sophisticated offices will have country-level plans that, because of they perhaps are fairly evolved in terms of their international student populations, so they have very significant diversification plans in place to broaden the scope of where they're bringing students in beyond China. And that takes some care, it takes a real focus, and not every institution can do that and give it the attention it deserves. So that's that's always, those kind of questions for me are always the initial starting point for future collaboration with institutions, just to get a sense of what the baseline is and what the needs are moving forward. Because strategic planning is not easy, and to do it well and to be able to then not only plan it but also implement it are two very different skill sets, frankly. You can have a lot of great ideas, you can get them down on paper and put together some terms and that make sense and maybe ones that you would want in a plan in terms of giving it some measurable outcomes, to give it some timelines and make it realistic and achievable. So those are not automatic skills that everybody has, and certainly some places like to dream, and dreaming's fine, but if you're going to be sincere about developing a plan and then implementing it and producing the results you're hoping to achieve, you really have to have the attention to detail. So not just that big picture vision, which is needed to really drive a lot of conversations, but you really want to make sure that you are taking the time and effort to think through what's really possible, what's really achievable, who are the people that need to be part of that conversation, because it's not always the same people, and it's typically, when we're talking international, we're talking about it takes a village type of process to enroll a class, but also to graduate a class, and that's the piece when I talk international strategic plans for enrollment offices, international offices. I always ask them, okay, we've been operating in this enrollment management sphere since the 80s, really, and early 90s, and where it's become quite in vogue you have vice president for enrollment management or vice provost, whatever it might be. That chief enrollment officer has as part of their task not only the recruitment and enrollment of those students, but the retention of those students, and eventually graduation rates factor into that office. And enrollment management should be a holistic approach to student life, to their from prospect all the way through to alumni, and that's the approach that I certainly want institutions to be moving toward. It's not always achievable in the first year. Sometimes it's a 2-3 year process because there are a lot of moving parts at universities. Even small colleges will have multiple offices that have responsibilities for different parts of international student life. But it's a conversation that needs to happen, and it needs to happen on multiple levels within the institution. So the session that I presented here at UNLV with UNLV at ACRO, it was one called Starting at Square One, Internationalization at UNLV, and I'll drop the link to a slide share of that presentation in the notes in the comment section on the different social platforms for this chat, and you're welcome to check those out. I think what's important when I pose the question about do you have an international strategic plan is, if you don't, to start thinking that way, because sometimes you need to take some steps back from what your day-to-day is like, and really it's sometimes hard, given the pandemic and stretched resources and all of that, the time to have these conversations and to involve the different players on campus that should be part of that conversation can take quite some time. It's not just going to happen overnight. In one conversation I'm having with an institution now, we initially were planning for May, but then April or May, but the presidents and provosts who needed to be at the table for those bigger picture conversations weren't going to be available till early June. Then there was a conflict there, so we're moving that to perhaps coincide with another event later in the summer. But this is something that, if you're going to do it right, you want to make sure the right people are on the table, the decision makers that should be around the table, that can be influenced, that will influence and help you implement what your vision is for internationalization on your campus. So, and again, internationalization takes a lot of different shapes and forms. Some will see it only as an international student enrollment piece. Some will see it as a combination of that plus study abroad. Some will say it's institutional partnerships as well. It's also going to be internationalizing the curriculum and faculty exchanges, all of that. So there's not a lot of different levels to it, but where most will start is going to be on that student enrollment side. And what I always challenge my college and university partners who are asking me to come in and help with developing these plans is, do you have the right people around the table that are going to be able to not just help you devise the plan, but also implement it? Because not everybody has to be in the same conversations all the way through this process, but certainly there needs to be a core group that help drive things forward, that can really make those decisions and impact and the change that's necessary. And then there's a separate group of individuals that will be the implementers, that will be the worker bees. You may have roles in that yourself, depending on your position and the size of your institution, to actually make those things happen. But there needs to be multiple sets of people that will be part of that larger conversation and also the implementation of the strategic plan. So what we did in our presentation was really take people back to kind of the history of this institution and their lack of intentionality when it came to international student recruitment and things international in general. The focus at UNLV for many years has been diversity has been one of their core values and really represents who they are. So new president comes in, energy was kind of behind moving internationalization onto that same platform. So it wouldn't be just diversity, it would be domestic diversity, it would be international diversity as well. And a strategic plan, a 10-year strategic plan with some very broad strokes, obviously, was written in about 2 months and is now in the process of being implemented. So there were the initial motivation driven by the provost and president, a new president who had come over from Wayne State, Keith Whitfield, who had some really great experiences there in his role. I think he was in provost role there with a senior international officer that helped him develop some very concrete programs and internationalization efforts. So he came in, and during the pandemic, there was a real push to, okay, we gotta step outside, and in anticipation of this demographic cliff coming up in 2025, 26, there was the intentionality of, okay, we gotta get serious about international. They had 1,000 international students on campus pre-pandemic, and so without even trying, really, they had facilities and some very basic processes in place that certainly were not student-friendly for internationals. But that's part of the evolution of what we're trying to do in the last few months, is put in place the kinds of digital presence, international student-friendly content and website processes that they can go through from an RFI to an international application, separate international application that's in development now for the next cycle, to a fairly comprehensive ComFlow overview or overhaul. And there's all these different pieces, and the goal is to grow both graduate and undergraduate international enrollments, and that we knew that there were some not quick fixes, but things that we could do to make the processes go much more smoothly than they were. But there are still some functional things that need to be sorted through, as there are in any college campus. But we're in the process of putting in place the kind of strategic elements that really will make things provide a solid foundation for things moving forward. So having that strategic plan is something I just want to circle back to. Is it's not just you have it or you don't. It's, well, we thought about it, we want to have one, but we know there's considerable energy that's going to be required to make that happen. And a lot of different elements on your campus will need to align properly in order for that to work. So my goal when any college comes calling and says, hey, we need some help organizing this, and that's part of what I can do, is provide that level of service to make sure we have the right people around the table to ask the right questions and to be pointing people in the right direction for how we can really change things and turn things around in the direction that makes most sense for your college or university. So I'll put the links to those plans. And for each of the colleges I'm working with now, we use what I've developed over the past 2 years called the 6 P's of strategic international enrollment management. And I mention these P's fairly often here on the Roundup. We talk very often about perspective and how having a global perspective is one of the most important elements to help get your institution aligned with the changes that are going on in the world, and awareness of those changes and how other institutions in other countries are recruiting and how we're actually competing for the same students oftentimes. So messaging is important, how your processes go, how complicated you make it, how well you are able to articulate your values. Do you have funding in place? Do you have appropriate housing and English language training and all of these other elements, in addition to having great academic programs? Then we build in the orientation programming, and that's the handoffs from one unit to the next, and involving on a second or third or fourth level the entire student experience. How are you engaging those students throughout the process, not just in the enrollment funnel, top of the enrollment funnel till the time they get on campus, but throughout their time on campus? How are you making sure their needs are being met through student life, through housing, through academic advising, through English language, through career services eventually and alumni offices? How are they engaging differently with your international students? Because frankly, there are differences in terms of their needs, in terms of what they're able to do, what they're not able to do, and how your institution responds to them in a very personal way, and a way that involves their peers at all levels, from prospect through to alumni. You need to be thinking through these issues, and that's part of the perspective issue that I help crystallize for a lot of institutions in terms of what's most important. So that strategic plan piece, I can't emphasize how important that is to giving a sense of stability, a sense of permanence, and really having the hard conversations on campus about why you need to have developed plans, well-articulated plans, to have not only the vision to put the plan together and to have lofty goals, but to make sure that they're properly resourced, and to have that conversation about what that looks like, and the staffing needs that as you grow populations, what international student office needs are, and what advising offices are, what English language program staffing should be at. All of these are vital conversations that need to happen. So that's something that hopefully you're getting more of that into how you develop your own programming. But if you need help along the way, please do be in touch and we can get you started. So question 3, and this is a fun one, the future one. What conferences will you be attending this year? Obviously, we're coming live from one of those that I'm attending, ACRO, here in Portland, for the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. This is primarily a domestic-focused conference. It's coming because of the presentation that I'm doing with the folks at UNLV. So this one is probably as close to what I think the new normal will be for conferences. For international educators, obviously the big one is at the end of May in Denver, Colorado this year, NAFSA. First time since Washington, D.C. in 2019. So it's first time in 3 years that this conference will have met. And for NAFSA, it's a big deal. They have to make this one work because their revenue, much of their revenue each year as an organization is dependent on the annual conference. And because they haven't had one for 2 years, this is in 2020 and 2021, this is going to be a big deal for the organization and for the field. We have not had, as I mentioned here, we have not had for NAFSA registration, we haven't been informed of vaccination requirements or anything like that. We already know that most of, I think 35 to 40% of the attendees in the past, pre-pandemic, were from abroad, from 70 countries or more. This is a conference that can sometimes have, at its peak, probably had over 10,000 individuals from around the world attend. But we know that travel is no longer easy internationally. all visitors to the U.S. and all U.S. citizens who are traveling internationally in order to enter the U.S. have to be vaccinated, fully vaccinated, more than 2 weeks beyond their second dose. And that is part of the requirement for travel right now to the U.S. So any international visitors, agents, other universities, staff that would be coming will need to be fully vaccinated in order to travel. So I think in terms of the expectations, we haven't been told yet for what's going to happen for NAFSA, but in terms of vaccination, but doing something like this Clear Pass would be an easy way for that to be done. So we'll see if they make use of that or other types of services like that. But certainly I would expect there'd be something, but we're less than 2 months away, so there's nothing been made, no decisions have been made yet on that. So we'll see what happens. Most people aren't expecting a full conference in terms of not going to be 10,000 people there this year, because international travel is still going to be difficult. There's still going to be hesitancy, and it's fairly expensive to travel because it can really be a budget suck if you haven't planned for this. I'll be going as part of my work with different colleges. I'll be representing them in some way or helping them get better connected to the international ed community, because that's really the place to be for in-person events at this one conference every year. So we'll see what develops, but it's going to be an interesting week in Denver. Right now they're saying masks will be worn in the conference, even though the city of Denver, much like many cities across the U.S., have lifted mask mandates. Whether or not that still is in place at the end of May, we'll see. At least that's been in the initial conversations. But outside of NAFSA, you're seeing also a return to in-person events for International ACAC coming up with their annual conference. That'll be in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the middle of July, and University of New Mexico is playing host for that. They were going to be the host in summer 2020, and they've last year they went virtual in 2020 and again in 2021. And they didn't want to, they've done so much work to get ready for it, and as a campus host, you really want the people to be on campus, and that's going to have potentially 500 college counselors, 750 U.S. And other university reps from around the world that will be attending. And again, that's primarily or exclusively for undergraduate students, mostly students in international schools overseas looking to enroll in universities around the world. So they are going to be in person. There haven't been any indications yet about mask mandates or vaccine requirements for that one. So we'll see. It's a very social conference, and very relaxed typically. So we'll see what that looks like in July. Followed shortly after International ACAC, we have the Education USA Forum, which will be in person in D.C. At the JW Marriott, and registration is now open for that one as well. So we'll see what that looks like. That's going to be a very intriguing conference, because they're bringing, just heard yesterday, they're bringing 53 advisors. All 14 REACs should be there. So that's certainly going to be a welcome event back on the calendar as well, with those three conferences, NAFSA, International ACAC, and of course with the EdUSA Forum in D.C. So we'll see how those three go. Those are the next big ones coming up for international educators, so hopefully we'll see you there at those conferences. But until next time, we wish you the very best, and we hope you're all safe and getting ready for a very busy summer conference season. Cheers.